Thank you for joining us. I'm Jessica from Impossible Foods. And for those of you that don't know us, Impossible Foods, we're a company that makes meat directly from plants. And this plant-based meat is actually a climate solution. It's a solution that has the capacity, if adopted broadly, could turn back the clock on climate change. So we are here at COP to receive the Momentum for Change Award in the Planetary Health category. Very excited for that tonight. And as part of that, we really do want to raise awareness of meat as a climate issue, but also about the solutions that we have here today and what we owe future generations in terms of solutions. And so we have collected this wonderful panel to discuss just that. It is being moderated by Clover Hogan. And Clover is a 20-year-old climate activist. She's a researcher on eco-anxiety and the founder of Force of Nature, a youth organization mobilizing the emerging generation of leaders. And I'm going to turn it over now to Clover to introduce the panel and to moderate this fireside chat here today.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. So I want to kick off with a question. How many of you here today ever feel overwhelmed by the climate crisis? Okay, great. So it's good to know that I'm not the only one. My name is Clover Hogan. I'm a climate activist, and my mission is to empower young people around the world to realize their potential to inspire change, to become radical agents of change. Now, often in the wake of protest, young people feel powerless when their demands are not met by those in perceived positions of authority. And it's easy to feel too small to make a difference in the context of token solutions. We're told to buy the reusable coffee cup, make the monthly donation, sign the petition, go to another beach cleanup. And yet we know that these solutions merely plaster over the problems. And so my invitation to young people is to go beyond incrementalism, to become radical agents of change, to become custodians of a future by our own design, and to redesign our systems. Because as we all well know in this room, the climate crisis is not the problem. It is the symptom of broken systems. From the clothes on my back, to how I got here today, to, most critically, the food in my fridge. The mother of broken systems is how we produce and consume food. Now today I'm joined by Salina Abraham, the Chief Learning Officer at the Global Landscapes Forum and the CEO and founder of Impossible Foods. Now, Salina and Pat, climate and agricultural experts around the world are telling us that unless we radically transform our global food system, namely animal agriculture, we are facing impending collapse. Food famine, food war, and runaway climate change. Where are we going wrong?
What a question.
I'm not sure who the we is, but I think something that you were touching on is that the kind of go-to move for a lot of people who care about a huge, complicated global issue like climate change is to basically demand that global institutions and governments and so forth clean up their act. And that's just, I wouldn't say it's a complete waste of time, but it's not an effective way of getting things done. And those institutions are not going to solve the problem. And I think that, so when you say where have we gone wrong, I'd say, well, for one thing, a lot of good intentions and powerful positive energy are being focused in the wrong direction. And I think it's, what we need to do is focus on grassroots solutions, things that individual initiative can have a big impact. Like cleaning up a beach is great, but if you can think about a way of doing this at scale that doesn't require imposing your will on other people, that's the way to approach it. And I think the other thing is that has to do with, I would say something that just warms my heart and I just love is the surge in engagement among people in your age group and younger in trying to really do something about these big global issues. I think the thing that they need to realize is that it's not the UN's job to solve it, and the UN is not going to solve it. It's not, the Australian government, the British government, the US government, the EU, China, anyone else's job to do it. You can make it your job to solve it. It's about taking individual initiative and not just assuming someone else will do it.
I don't disagree with you. I think that individual action is so important, and actually much of the solutions and the knowledge that we need to change this crisis is actually in the hands of so many local communities, of youth groups around the world. People are doing incredible actions in their communities, but at the same time, you were talking about systems change. There's these systems in place that do not support or give voice and enable local actors to actually create that change. And that's why I guess I'm really excited to be working in the space that I do at the Global Landscapes Forum. I mean, it's all about how do we enable these local grassroots movements to thrive? How do we share best practices across the space of land use, of climate change, of biodiversity loss, all these issues that are so complex and interrelated? How do we have people to start talking to each other and sharing these lessons learned? Because yes, I agree. I mean, it's so easy to shift blame and to say this problem is way too big and our governments have to solve it. It's the governments that are really supposed to be creating these societies and our infrastructure and this and that. But at the same time, we as individuals play a really crucial role in reinforcing these systems and in our choices and our desires and how we want to live our lives and really shaping the societies that are inherently based on the destruction of our planet and ecosystem. And it's not because we're running out into national parks and cutting down trees, but it's our energy consumption. It's how we move every day, and it's what we're going to talk about today, our food, and that's extremely personal.
And so, what could a different food future look like? And as we begin to bring that future into the present today, how do we invite everyone to the table?
I can talk about how I'm thinking about the problem. First of all, this was not my job to do, but I just felt like no one else is doing it, and that's why I got into this. And I think that's the way I think super enthusiastic young people like you should think about it, is that no one's going to ask you to step up, and you are not the natural person to step up and try to solve a problem in a big way beyond cleaning up a beach, but it might as well be you, and that's, I think, an important point. But the way that we're thinking about particularly the food problem is it's not going to be solved by telling people what to do. It's not going to be solved by even shaming them, educating them about what a terrible problem this is. Our diets have a huge role in creating this catastrophe and stuff like that. All true, that's not going to solve it. And shouting at people isn't going to solve it. You have to figure out a subversive way of doing it. And I think that subversion is an underemployed strategy. The way that we're approaching this problem is, our goal is to completely eliminate the use of animals in the food system by 2035. And we're not going to do this by declaring war on the animal ag industry or having a PR campaign about diet and so forth. It's to figure out how we can create better foods that better serve the consumers that are currently keeping that industry going than the ones that are made from animals. It's a technology problem. The use of animals in the food system It's a prehistoric technology, incredibly inefficient. That's why it's so destructive. It's a huge opportunity for better technology, and it's the same with the energy system. The progress we're making in reducing the carbon footprint of the energy system is mostly by figuring out how better technology, and it's not better technology to impose on consumers. It's figuring out how to make it do a better job of satisfying, of giving them what they value, and I think that's a useful way of thinking about solving lots of problems. In our case, we are completely confident that we're going to replace animals as a food production technology globally, because it's such a shitty technology, and not just in terms of how destructive it is, but how incredibly inefficient it is. There's such huge opportunities to improve it, and it's fundamentally unimprovable. Whereas if you understand flavor, texture, all the things that make meat, fish, and dairy foods delicious to consumers, you can do a better job than the animals of delivering deliciousness. They never were optimized for deliciousness. They just were domesticated, and you get what you get. But this is an opportunity to do better. Just as 200 years ago, we replaced the horse with a technology that initially wasn't as good as the horse, but was continuously improvable, and did a better job of serving consumers. And that's how it took over. Anyway, sorry, long spiel. And the last thing I want to say is, a critical point is that because the land footprint of animal agriculture is, like, for all practical purposes, the land footprint of humanity, it occupies 45% of Earth's land area, whereas all the cities in the world with more than 100,000 population could fit on 1% of Earth's land area. It represents the biggest opportunity to turn back the clock on climate change, because if you simply remove the economic incentive for covering the planet with domesticated animals and the crops that feed them, and allow the ecosystems that are native to those areas and previously existed to recover, it's simple math. You can immediately start turning back the clock on atmospheric CO2. It will actually begin bringing atmospheric CO2 levels down. This is an amazing opportunity to do something that no one even talks about. Not just reducing the rate of increase in atmospheric CO2, but bringing it down. And it's simple. You just have to make the most delicious meat in the world directly from plants.
Just like that.
I'm not going to take any more time. Sorry.
And so, thank you for that, Pat. And Salina, you work with thousands of young people to actually protect these critical spaces, these local ecosystems, and you have a very good understanding of the cultural nuance that is involved with that and how to invite young people to the table. When it comes to the relationship between this youth movement and the private sector especially, how can leaders across policy and across business, across wider society, invite young people into those conversations, especially in the global south, where people are already experiencing the worst impacts of the climate crisis, especially in the context of agriculture and crop yields?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. But on one hand, I feel like young people in the private sector were very well matched. We carry the same innovative spirit. A lot of the youth organizations we work in, we work like startups. We've got our mission, we've got all the energy in the world to solve them, and we don't want to wait for these big we don't care about the regulatory kind of the systems in place. We're just going to do what we do and change the world. And so on one hand, I think that there's such a great fit. In many successful, companies actually have quite a young age, and that's because of that kind of innovative spirit. But I will say that amazing youth groups who are restoring ecosystems, who are protecting them, who are learning how to do the right thing in their landscapes, they don't have the skills and the resources to think strategically. I mean, what you talk about here is you've created a timeline, you've done an analysis of what's the problem, and actually the best way is not giving people new information, it's giving them what they want. Food, it's about, I want to taste meat because it's delicious, I don't want to give up my burger or my tacos. And when Impossible Foods catered at our event in New York, I got to have both the burger and the tacos, and I'm happy. So you've found a way to really look deeply into the issue and then find the most effective way to solve that problem. And I think what we see now a lot is a ton of young people, a lot of energy, and our time is going in, but is it going in the most effective way to solve our problem? And we don't 100% know what that is. And so working with the GLF, the Youth and Landscapes Initiative, we're trying to bring and blend these different types of knowledge together. So how do we empower them? What are the things that they're missing? What are the tools we can give them to become the most effective agents of change? So I think that we really do have to, in the same way that you've analyzed this food systems challenge, we have to look at what is the same challenge for young people, and then how do we then bring them in and help them build these transformative businesses and actions that are quietly changing people's habits and quietly saving the world.
Absolutely. And I think we can all attest to the fact that when we bring together the energy of youth with the knowledge of experience, that's when we can actually make the magic happen. So with that, I would love to open up the floor now to questions from the audience. So if we have a roving mic, we have one question up here.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I come from a small East European country, and rather from addressing a question, I would like to expose a situation and hope that you can comment upon this. We know that youth should be mobilized, should be encouraged. They have the energy, they have the passion. Good. We know that most of the issues are in the rural areas. So the best thing is that our youth to go in the rural areas and work and implement projects. Another moment. The salary in my country to work in rural area is $200 per month. So if I work on reports and coffee breaks, seminars in the capital city, maybe I can come to events like this. But if I work on concrete, real projects in rural area, I should get money working 4 months in order to come here. And you talk about enthusiasm. Well, I can get enthusiasm for 4 months, but I should feed myself. And it's less likely that I'll be enthusiastic to work in order to come here, to get enthusiastic and work in the rural area. So please comment, because this is the reality in most of the countries. East Europe, but not only. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a great point, and it's something we didn't necessarily touch on here, is that there's differing realities. There's kind of this duality, and I'm an Eritrean American, so I'm used to living in that kind of space where I grew up in an industrialized city where you don't even understand what the concept of land is by your everyday movements. But on the other hand, my family's from Eritrea. You go there and you're talking about a rural village, highland farmers. Land is everything. And the way our world is shifting and what we perceive as growth and development, people are moving into these cities and into these environments that are inherently destroying our planet. And I think your point is very well made, and it's something that we are trying to solve, is that there is no one, youth need employment, right? We're not going to tell people to go back and live in a backwards way. That if they want access to technology, to internet, to friends, to a social life, things that you necessarily don't always have in a rural environment, depending on where you are. And so what we're working on at this stage within the Youth and Landscapes Initiative is how do we create viable business cases for these projects? Something that is restoring the ecosystem, and how do we then create an actual level of employment, of a viable job, of an interest rate maybe back to an investor. And so these are these kind of situations that we really have to try to solve. But I think it's not about looking backwards. It's about creating a new future. And to do that, we have some really big challenges ahead of us, but I think that it's really about bringing together all these different stakeholders and solving those issues. So yeah, I would just say let's continue to have that conversation, and it needs to be done not just by young people, not just by the private sector. It was,
Okay.
yeah.
I can't add much to that.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, over here.
Well, thank you for this. What you do is great to accelerate change in this context. I'm from Argentina, from the global south. Our country is a great food producer as well, and livestock is huge. We have more cows than people in our country, and they are cutting down the trees to expand the frontier, and well, we know all these problems. So we consider that this is not a matter of personal choice anymore when we are in this context of climate and ecological emergency, because it's not an opinion I could have to keep on using fossil fuels or not, to keep having an inefficient food production system is not an option anymore for us, for the youth. So thank you for this. And how do you think we can accelerate change in the food production system in the global south? Maybe you can bring Impossible Foods soon?
Well, I would love to do that. Actually, I think it's a lot of times the conversation is framed as if, if we change from the current sort of agricultural system, which is incredibly destructive and inefficient, to one that's less destructive and vastly more resource efficient, that change will come at the expense of people in agriculture. But it's not necessarily true. If you imagine that you're producing the same amount of food, it's valued just as much by consumers, it's produced in a much more resource effective way, nevertheless, it's produced from ingredients and raw materials that are grown on farms by farmers. It's a transformation of the system, and no doubt disruptive. But I think that it doesn't have to come at the expense of people who make their living in farming. And in fact, I think if you make it more resource efficient, a larger fraction of what consumers pay for their food can go to the workers in the system, as opposed to being wasted on vast amounts of fertilizer and pesticides and water and land and so forth that are used so inefficiently. But it's definitely something we at Impossible Foods actually spend a surprisingly large amount of time thinking about. How we're completely confident that by doing a better job of making products that consumers want, we'll achieve our goal. But how can we do it in a way that protects the interests of people who are engaged in the current system and so forth, and they're just trying to make a living? It's a hard problem. Well, we need, this is definitely a kind of problem where we need lots of great ideas, and I encourage nothing, these are complicated problems, so if you have ideas, that's great. I just want to say one thing about something that you said about young people being engaged, which is, I think you underestimate yourself. I'm not an expert on food. I wasn't an expert on climate. I just decided that this is something I wanted to do and taught myself. So I was not the right person to do what we're doing. And I think this is a big thing that holds back initiative from highly engaged and motivated young people. They think, oh, well, I'm not an expert, so how can I do that? Well, just decide to do it. That's what makes you, the minute you decide to do something and take an action, you are way ahead of the pack. And it's like initiative is what matters. So don't count yourself out, basically.
Good advice. Any other questions? Yes, over here.
My name is Tammy. I'm from Arizona State University. Earlier, someone mentioned that I'm a huge supporter of Impossible and other alternative meat options, but if the ultimate goal is to slowly transition to alternative meats and vegetarian, vegan-based lifestyle, do you have statistics on, more in the context of the US, statistics on people and their rate of meat consumption, if that's declining? Because I noticed that even if people are interested in Impossible Foods and things like that, like the meat consumption, they're still going to be consuming meat. It's not going to be their ultimate transition over. So how would you Do you know the statistics on that? And furthermore, how would you recommend, or what are your actions to actually implement this complete transition?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there are some. So we have a lot of data on that actually. So one thing that I think you might find interesting is that among our consumers in the U.S., and we've been surveying this pretty much every month for probably at least a year. 95% of the people who buy the Impossible meat are people who have bought meat from an animal in the preceding month. So they're people who see themselves as meat consumers. And we also are just now starting to get some data that basically says a large fraction of those purchases come at the expense of meat from animals, i.e., had our product not been there, they would have bought the animal version of it, okay? So all that is good. But what you're saying is that the mere availability of one plant-based meat product that they like doesn't cause them to abandon consumption of meat from animals. It doesn't solve the whole problem. And absolutely right. There are a handful of people who told me, but it's a very distinct minority, that the availability of this one product was enough for them to just say, okay, I'm not going to be using animals for food anymore. But it hasn't solved the problem. It's not going to solve the problem. For us, it's basically, we have to take the products that we're making and future products and never stop making them better until making them more delicious, better nutritionally, more affordable, until every consumer will say, this is a better product in every way that I care about. Doesn't matter even care, they don't even know anything about climate or the role of agriculture in climate. If you do that, you win. But that's a hard job, and that's what we're embarked on. So we're working on all the other animal products, and we're never going to stop making our existing product better, basically because we can. Just like when you switch from the horse to motorized transportation, the big advantage wasn't that it was better right away. It was that it never stopped getting better, and it's still getting better today. So that's how to do it, is just never be complacent. The problem is not solved as soon as you've taken the first step. It's a long, hard job.
I want to comment on that a little bit because I found it really funny that I hadn't heard of Impossible Foods, but my two sisters, they are not in the climate conversation at all. They know nothing. They're like, Impossible Foods? Oh my God, I can't believe it. So you have done an exceptionally good job at talking to the people who love meat, eat meat all the time, I guess don't really pay attention to the climate, but are still a fan of this type of way of eating. And so I think that this business model is actually really great because food is so personal. Like when I was thinking about my own food future, I'm thinking, what do I like? What do I want to eat? It's going in your body. It's just so, it's freedom. And people don't want their freedom ever taken away from them.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the other thing is that one thing that we've done, and it's just core to how we think about our job, is respect the consumers that we're trying to serve. There's a huge global problem, but it's not, don't blame it on people who have grown up their whole lives, eating certain foods and habituate to them and so forth. You have to treat everybody with respect. We treat the meat consumers with respect. We don't try to shame them we don't say, you're ruining the world or something like that. I think that's a big part of it. That's part of what has enabled us to really engage with the consumers we're trying to target.
Absolutely. It's something that we talk about a lot in our research is the difference between triggers and catalysts. Triggers being the things that kind of cause us to shut down, and catalysts the things that inspire us to really step up. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been so deeply personal, kind of whether you eat meat or whether you eat plants, a lot of people have shut down because we've typically used a super singular kind of narrative about what that means. Yeah. And that's what's really exciting when you actually turn it into something that is hugely empowering. Like reducing how much meat you eat in your diet is arguably the single best thing that you can do for the planet, for the environment, for society, for the climate. And that, I think, is a hugely exciting invitation for people.
But it's really hard for people to do. And it's always striking to me when I come to an event like this where there are people who live and breathe, global environmental issues and climate issues and so forth. And the vast majority of them are consuming meat every day. And I'm not criticizing that at all. It's just human nature. But it shows how hard the problem is. And the way to solve it is not to polarize. I mean, the other thing is that related to the question I just had, we don't ask people to switch from being meat eaters to vegans. It's not like, you have to choose sides here. It's our job to make a product that you want to buy, basically. And if you want to buy it once, great. If we can make it good enough that you want to buy it repeatedly, great. But if you're still eating all kinds of other meats or something like that, we're not going to say no. Sorry, you got to become vegan. It's our job to try to, make plant-based products that deliver what you want and not try to polarize it. Yeah.
We'll take one more question. Yes.
Yes, good morning. Ingo's my name. One of my backgrounds is in renewable energy. And an analogy, of course, renewable energy had to fight for becoming mainstream, and we broke through, not because it was such an amazing user experience, it is, but because the prices dropped. And if I look at the resource efficiency advantages that plant-based products should have over meat, never mind the subsidies that meats are getting, just the way fossil energy is getting massive subsidies, but taking into account subsidies, renewable energy is now competitive. When is plant-based meat competitive? So when do we have meat parity? Because I believe that mainstream consumers who are not so picky, who are price-driven, they will make the choice. For them, it's like vegan, non-vegan, give me my protein for the lowest price.
Yeah.
When do we get to meat parity?
Oh, I think you raise a really good point, which is that the economic fundamentals of making meat directly from plants are so vastly superior. So if we take our current product, we've done a life cycle analysis, it uses, what's 9 times less greenhouse gas emissions, but that doesn't affect the price unless there's a price on carbon. But it uses 8 times less water, 12 times less fertilizer input, and more than 25-fold less land, okay? What that means is structurally the economics are better, okay? Because those are all expenses of meat production. And it's just like with the renewable energy stuff. What you need to do is when you first launch, you don't have economies of scale. And you have a lot of expenses that are specific to the cost of developing products and stuff like that. As you scale, you realize the benefits of whatever economic fundamentals you have in your favor. In our case, they're so vastly in our favor. It's just a matter of getting to scale. But and the other thing that's important about this, it's not just about climate. And one of the other issues that I always talk about is biodiversity, which is the animal-based food industry is essentially entirely responsible for the catastrophic collapse of global biodiversity. But the other thing is food availability. People who are food insecure, the biggest source of macronutrient malnutrition is protein malnutrition. It affects almost 1 billion people globally. Iron deficiency is the biggest micronutrient deficiency. It affects almost 2 billion people globally. The foods that we can make from plants, plant-based meats, are awesome sources of protein and iron. And so it's a huge part of our mission to get the price to the level where they become affordable to people in these very poor countries where these nutritional issues are endemic. So yeah, that's a super high priority. It needs to be.
And I would love to, on that topic, pivot to you for a moment, Salina, because you touched on something hugely important, Pat, which is biodiversity. And often we can focus so arbitrarily on targets that are rendered to degrees and warming that are way out there, but we are experiencing the sixth mass extinction today, right now. Animal agriculture is the leading driver of this extinction. What is the role in the work that you do of instilling ecophilia in young people, love for nature, and how do we all become better champions of this mission? Because if we don't truly appreciate what it is that we're losing, I'd say we can't expect people to mobilize en masse.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I guess people don't realize enough how interconnected everything is. And that, at first I remember when we started talking about biodiversity, I was like, well, I care about people, not like animals, And I didn't realize that actually biodiversity was really a crucial measure for ecosystem health, and ecosystem health is what people rely on, and this is going to be crucial for how resilient ecosystems and how we're able to adapt to climate change. And so there's this, people walk into so many conversations unaware of these connections, and part of my awakening or my enlightenment really was joining this organization and realizing that we need to have these conversations together, and they're very difficult conversations. And we'll see this next year. GLF's focus in 2020 is food and livelihoods. It's finally having this conversation and bringing the farmers, the indigenous peoples, the private sector, and Possible Foods together and saying, okay, what are the big elephants in the room that we have avoided? And how can we start talking about them and building solutions together and not shouting at each other from different angles, because that's not actually helping us. And so I think that to answer your question, it's ecosystem restoration and protection is crucial. It's at the heart of our viability as human beings. But we need to come back to that and to be able to realize that. And in a way, it's bringing meaning back to what that means, and also enabling young people to actually be able to restore land and to restore hope and resilience and strength in communities. And so we're really excited to try to tackle that next year, because it's very easy to work in your own little silo, and it's really now time to bring forests and food together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll open out the floor for a couple more questions. Yes.
Hi guys, and thank you for this important topic. I spent 20 years in the United States Navy and retired about almost 4 years ago now. One thing that I noticed in my entire time in service was that when I first was on my first ships and even in my first boot camp days, we only had, mainly meat-based diets. Now, 20 some years later, you go to galleys, you go to different ships, and there's no more frying pans, for example. There's options for like soy milk and way more vegetarian options, right? I'm still a meat eater, but I have, gradually divested, right? So eat more plant-based food, and that's kind of the way that I radicalize my friends and all of my military folk into like, doing more of that plant-based dieting, and then, allow for less consumption of meat. But one thing that I find very, very heartwarming is that when I go to like commissaries, which are markets, right, for the food that we buy in our bases, now we have more and more options that are, plant-based. And I haven't seen Impossible Foods getting in there yet. I hope to see it pretty soon. But at the same time, I think getting into those markets, right, getting into, we can get into the argument of how much damage has been done by the military all across the world. And the United States military is the #1 polluter in the planet. The one single entity comes out of the Department of Defense. We know that, but a lot of that has to do with the consumption of meat products that are done all across the different bases around the world, all in our ships, in the galleys, in the shower holes. And if we're able to at least start integrating this part of the market that is helping divest from that, but we start leaning away from all this cruelty that we are perpetrating, right? And what is the process that you are, I guess, hopefully trying to pursue towards getting a foothold in there and expanding that footprint towards this more just consumption? And thank you so much again for this topic.
Well, I'll just answer quickly. We are still in the very early stages of scaling up. Right now, in the U.S. we have more demand than we can supply to, and we're racing to scale up production and so forth. The military is a very interesting one, actually. I think I don't know what the demographics of the military are, but my guess is that it's disproportionately people spend time in the military at a young age. Same is true of colleges and universities and K-12 schools and so forth. And I think for us, that makes those places, not because it's the military, but because it's the critical thing for getting people to change their attitudes about plant-based food is to get them to try a product that really delivers what they want as meat. And doing that to people who are young, they tend to be more receptive to new things, and then you get the lifelong benefits of changing their habits is really important. So I think that's a really interesting point. For us, it's mainly a matter of just scaling, basically, but really good suggestion.
And I think one thing that you touched on is this kind of like intersectionality, which is really an important part of the conversation as well. And just as you said, Salina, at first for you, it was very much about social justice, and then that expanded into biodiversity as you came to understand the relationship between those things. And if we look at Project Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, in fact, the only plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, we see the intersectionality between empowering women in developing parts of the world to actually have autonomy and become custodians of the land. We look at how we're able to preserve tropical forests. We look at reducing food waste management. Currently, we waste over 40% of food in America and a third of all food globally. So as we begin to create change in each of these spaces and within these institutions, we see the positive impact across all of society. So we'll take one final question from the audience. Yes, in the back over here.
Hi, my name is Sheena. I came from Japan, and as everyone knows, that we eat like sushi and fish on daily basis. My question is, not eating meat and not eating fish can be the way to destroy a culture. So I kind of want to ask about what do you think about it?
What? I'm sorry, I didn't
Like
fully.
Huh?
I don't know whether maybe you heard the question. I didn't quite understand the question.
My question is like, what do you think about not eating meat or fish can be the way to destroy culture? So like traditional food.
I think that it's a very interesting question. It gets asked a lot. I'll answer quickly, and then you might have a better answer. I think it's the way that we're approaching it is we don't want to ask people to change their traditional eating practices, okay? We want to solve the problem by figuring out a way to produce foods more sustainably from plants that can fit into their habits. Because basically, otherwise, we're not going to actively destroy a culture. If consumers don't want to buy the products and use it as sushi or whatever, they don't have to, right? We're not telling people what to do. It becomes our job to make something that fits into their culture, satisfies, what they're looking for, et cetera. And that's how it goes. Now, if your culture is about, harvesting whales or something like that, well, then there may not be enough demand for whale meat to support that. Great thing for the world, not so great for the people who make their living that way. But that's unfortunately a lot of things that make the world better. They don't do so with perfect precision and no collateral damage. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think it's a fear or a concern that a lot of us have when we talk about things like eliminating, because it feels like there's a loss in a way. And I think in any transition, there are those who adapt and thrive are those with the power and resources to do so. And so just as we talk about just transitions in climate, we have to talk about that with food. And what does that look like in different regions of the world and the different consumption patterns? And for example, in Africa, like there will be rangelands, and there will be people who make their living off of, raising cattle. And so we need to think and design a future for ourselves, and I think it's going to be really specific and unique to people's cultures and countries. And I think what's really beautiful about Impossible Foods actually is that it kind of fits squarely in this culture of America. And if you're looking at this culture, this consumption pattern, like it fits. And as we talk about how we also innovate in different countries and different regions and cultures, there will be solutions that may be adapted. It may be a new version of Impossible Foods that needs to come up. And so I think it's good that this is a catalyst for us to start having that conversation.
Yeah, I think it's the thing about a market-based approach as opposed to something imposed top-down or coerced, is that it only works if it delivers for people what they decide they want, as opposed to just telling them what to do.
And with that, a final call to action from both of you for our audience.
I would say I've been very much inspired by Pat saying that we don't have to be an expert to join into this conversation. And so thank you, for having me join this conversation. So I think that I want everyone to have the courage to start stepping into spaces that we maybe have not stepped into before, and to feel confident in our ability to start shaping our own future. So join me in that. This has been my first step, so I'm hoping to take step 2 with more people.
Well, I guess I would just say that the thing you have to have your mindset that we can do this. This is a solvable problem. This is not something that is just inevitably going to overwhelm us. There's a huge need for lots of people to take their ideas and really take them forward. And some of them will fail and some of them will succeed. But if you think of this as empower yourselves, this is a solvable problem. We have maybe 15 years to massively turn back the clock on climate change. So it's an urgent problem, but don't despair, solve it.
A huge thank you to our audience and a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
And also with that, we did want to offer you a shirt. It might get you thinking about this solution and the challenge here. So if anyone wants one, please take one. We'll be down here. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
How big is your audience?